The last time we left off was when the Janissaries destroyed the new order and killed Selim III in the process, thereby halting the attempts for reform. Despite defeated for now, the idea of military reform lived on. Although their new army was a failure, Selim III and his loyalists did not die in vain. The New Order army did have an important influence on Ottoman reform later in the 19th century. Its fate showed those reformers who survived the importance of destroying the military arm of reaction and of expanding the scope and depth of reform if success was to be achieved. Moreover, its officers and men provided the nucleus for a new army, while its basic organization and regulations were followed almost without change by this and succeeding military forces created prior to the Crimean War. Selim's new army thus provided the example, the lesson, the model, and the nucleus for the military reforms which were to follow. But for now, Mahmud II's, who followed Selim III, best choice was to wait. During the next 18 years, he did not take direct actions against the Janissaries' interests, but instead tightened his control on the empire. By 1820, a large majority of the Porte had consolidated its authority over large parts of Rumelia and most of Anatolia. With the help of the modernized army, the Porte managed to suppress the Greek rebellion of 1822. By 1826, Mahmud II managed to establish his direct control over the provinces and financial resources in Rumelia and Anatolia. Between 1806 and 1821, Mahmud II subdued the Janissary strongholds such as in Aleppo, Crete and Thessaloniki. This condition was interpreted as Mahmud II's preparation for the destruction of the Janissaries. Nevertheless, Mahmud II's reforms were not directed towards the Janissaries. He did not strip them from their privileges, nor did he introduce new infantry. Extra attention was paid to the units of the artillery and the cannon and cannon wagon corps. The numbers of these elite units were increased. The corps was equipped with modern weapons and the salaries were raised. By 1827, the artillery and its support units numbered more than 18,000 men. In addition, other branches of arms were modernized. In short, a storm developed, but the Janissaries were not able to see it. In addition, the Janissaries continued to deliver arguments against their own justification when the empire faced further internal and external threats. In 1811, the Janissaries simply refused to join a campaign along the Danube. Instead, some deserters robbed the war chest. Additionally, they managed to alienate the religious establishment, which had supported them in the rebellions against Selim III. The Sultan, on the other hand, tried to flatter the theologians as much as possible by supporting their foundations. In short, Mahmud built alliances for his purposes, while the Janissaries destroyed theirs. The Serbians revolted 3 times between 1804 and 1817 and became semi-autonomous. In 1821 the Greeks followed suit. The Janissaries reacted with plundering and massacres, as well as letting themselves being defeated by rebel bands in 1821 and 1822. In the end, the Ottomans decided to ask for Egyptian troops, who continued the massacres until a combined British, French and Russian squadron annihilated the Egyptian and Ottoman navies by accident in 1827, leading to the founding of the Greek nation-state in 1830. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II finished his preparations. He had his men in important positions, most of the empire was back under his control, and the Janissaries had spent the last years humiliating themselves. Now it was time to throw down the gauntlet and challenge the Janissaries. It began on the 25th of May 1826 with a meeting of the Divan, in which leading jurists stated their opinion that it was the duty of Muslims to study war. The 3 leading commanders of the Janissaries were present and listened to the following proposal. In May 1826, Sultan Mahmud issued an edict for the formation of a new military corps, initially numbering in excess of 7,500 men, to be recruited by drawing 150 men from each of the 51 Janissary companies in Istanbul. around 1/5 of the total number of Janissaries on active duty. Everyone present declared his conviction that this proposal was legal, necessary and a very good idea. Completely unrelated to that, the top Agas of the Janissaries were given prospects of further promotions. On the 28th of May, the Shaykh al-Islam gave his consent, and the proposed reforms were made public. Goodwin explains why the theologians were eager to follow the Sultan's proposal. Training was to be preceded by prayers, led by the regimental imam. The importance of this measure was that the official Sunni school of Islam was to be established within the barracks, where the Bektashi dervish order had held sway since the end of the 16th century. Thus, the soldiery were to be recalled to orthodoxy from the Sufi path, which the ulema proclaimed to be the road to hell, and the ministers feared as mystical and subversive. If the Janissaries had to go, so had the Bektashi dervishes. In return, the religious establishment had the task of delivering the message to the Janissaries. They seem to have done a good job, since the Janissaries dared not to resist. The first drill of the Eskinchi Corps on 12th June 1826 went off without trouble, albeit in an atmosphere of great apprehension. Shortage of uniforms and equipment meant that the number of men present to be put through their paces was only several hundred out of the 5,000 already enrolled. The next day's drill also passed off completely without incident. In order to avoid problems with the religious decree forbidding new kinds of troops, Mahmud gave his new army a nice-sounding name: the Trained Victorious Soldiers of Muhammad. An army that has training in its name, victory decreed, and fights for Muhammad. Who could reject such a corps? The Janissaries could. On the 14th of June 1826 they had enough and gathered in the parade grounds. On the night of Thursday, 1 month after the passing of the decree, the plotters arrived in 2s or 3s at the Maidan, beyond the great gate of the barracks. In a very short time the parade ground was filled with rebels. As tradition demanded, the Janissaries turned over the cauldrons and occupied important streets, thereby cutting off the Topkapi from the outside. Towards some state officials they declared their motives. "We will not do this sort of drill. Our ancient practice and drill for war is to hit earth-worn chucks with rifle shot and to hack at felt matting with the saber. We want to lay our hands on those responsible for this innovation." The first on the list was the Aga. Some among them roamed the streets of Istanbul, firing guns and starting fires, and looking for their commander-in-chief whom they felt had sold them out. Mehmed Celaleddin was the Aga of the Janissaries at this point, and he cooperated with the Sultan, who had replaced the Aga of the Janissaries at least on a yearly basis. Mehmed Celaleddin managed to escape and got a promotion after the events, but the mob destroyed his home. The Aga was not to envy. He was between a rock and a hard place, the rock being the Janissaries, taking him responsible for every attempt against them, maybe even killing him, and the hard place being the Sultan, dismissing or executing the Aga whenever the Janissaries became unruly. The method of Mahmud II was simple. If the candidate's loyalty was under suspicion, he would be replaced immediately. Thus the Sultan filled the ranks of the administration with his most trusted men that pledged unquestionable loyalty. By 1826 there were 26 living ex-Janissary commanders. Therefore the more junior commanders stayed as loyal as the officers in the highest ranks. It was the regular officers and the soldiery who led this revolt. But other than in earlier rebellions, this time the Sultan was prepared. One could also say that the revolt commenced as planned. Maybe he even anticipated the pillaging of the city and hoped that this would turn the populace against the Janissaries. Mahmud II had taken his precautions. In the city there were at least 30,000 loyal troops at the ready. The Sultan made a stirring speech on his arrival there, and following the Shaykh al-Islam's juridical opinion to the effect that Islamic law permitted such an uprising to be put down with force, Mahmud went into the treasury and brought out the sacred standard of the Prophet. Mahmud's hopes were fulfilled when the populace, especially religious students, fearing the rapacious Janissaries, took up arms and gathered around the Sultan. The first clash happened at the Horror Fountain between a company of Janissaries and artillery. The artillery was the most modern branch of arms because it survived the reaction against Sultan III's reforms. At the Horror Fountain, Ibrahim Aga came face to face with a company of Janissaries. He had the guns manned and attacked at once. Although 2 artillerymen were killed, one burst of grape shot had the rebels retreating post-haste to the Et Maidan, where their comrades rallied and, entering the barracks, closed the great door. This they proceeded to barricade with heavy stones. They had lost all initiative and abandoned many of their friends who were still roaming the streets. They appeared to believe that the fortress was impregnable. It took only this clash and the revolt turned into a siege. More loyalist troops reinforced the artillery. Attempts to negotiate failed and the Janissaries made plans for a sortie, with saber in hand as they were accustomed to. They gathered behind the great door. Then the artillery opened fire. This broke any resistance. The loyalists stormed the barracks, hunted down the Janissaries and set the place on fire. What followed was 21 minutes of bloodbath. After the final bombardment, the survivors went into hiding in the barracks at Bektashi Tekes. The final bombardment caused very tragic scenes. The Janissaries, who were stuck at Et Maidani, called out the names of their artillerymen friends and begged for their mercy. But in return, many of them were killed by cannonballs. The survivors who were captured while trying to flee were either stabbed or strangled by the loyalists. Patrols went through the streets, catching every Janissary they could. That every Janissary had the symbol of his order tattooed on an arm and a leg came in very handy for identification purposes. What happened in Istanbul on the 15th of June 1826 was a massacre, but it did not end there. The Janissaries, who were able to escape from the massacre in Et Maidani, were also hunted down throughout Istanbul. The central administration was selective in its targets, and the executions were limited to the remaining junior officers and the well-known Janissary leaders. Within 2 days following the destruction of the Janissaries, the Grand Vizier Mehmed Selim Pasha oversaw brief interrogations of nearly 200 Janissaries in his pavilion located near to Sultan Ahmed Mosque. After each interrogation, his men dragged the suspect to the nearby cellar under the mosque, and there executioners routinely practiced their craft. After this grim process, the dead bodies of the Janissaries were put to public exhibition in the Sultan Ahmed Square. This public exhibition intended to convey a clear message. The Janissary Corps had become a corrupt institution, unable to perform its basic functions as an effective army. Janissaries were responsible for defeats at the hands of the enemies of Islam. Notwithstanding their ineffectiveness, they also became a body of lawless rogues, terrorizing law-abiding subjects and the state. Thus, the abolition of the corps was a crucial service, both to the Ottoman society and the state, and anyone sympathizing with the cause or criticizing their abolition was likely to meet similar punishment. In Istanbul, it took the Sultan only 4 or 5 hours to suppress the uprising of the once feared Janissaries. After the massacre in Istanbul, most Janissary garrisons in the empire followed the government's orders without any opposition. Only a few places resisted. For example, in Tokat, the local governor had to show up with his retinue in order to execute 26 Janissary leaders. In Gaziantep, a Janissary stronghold, a major rebellion broke out, but the governor crushed it with superior numbers. It took a journey where the Janissaries were especially strong, nearly 6 months of careful calculations before the city followed the government's orders, but then executions and exiles followed. The central government won every one of those standoffs relatively quickly, except for what happened in Bosnia. Between August 1826 and February 1827, the Janissaries, with the support of the local populace, took control of the administrative center. The government reacted with the only instrument it knew, force, and sent in an army. But before bloodshed began, the Bosnians quickly submitted. At the same time in Istanbul, Sultan Mahmud II did not let down his guard, although the most important Janissaries had already died when the first bloodbath was over, and the Janissaries barracks were burnt down. Too threatening was the long series of successful uprisings. Although the majority of the Janissary leaders were eliminated and the Janissary barracks were in ruins, the ruling elite was still concerned about the Janissary elements within Istanbul's population. Afraid of assassination attempts by Janissaries, the Sultan ordered his ministers and high-ranking bureaucrats to reside within the palace quarters until the government became totally sure of their safety. For their safety, Istanbul's population had to pay the price. That was by following the abolition of the Janissary Corps, the central administration banned the usage of terms, titles, signs or anything reminding the public of the Janissaries. When the Janissary coffee houses were closed down after the abolition, government agents destroyed all the Janissary insignias in these coffee houses. Since the government closely monitored the public's reaction to the abolition, people had to pay special attention for not using the Janissary terms, titles and symbols, which had deeply penetrated the daily usage. The sources also state an example of a coffee house owner who did not take these orders seriously. He kept the insignia of his regiment public and the government reacted with all its force. The owner was interrogated and executed in front of his shop. A series of executions and exiles left Istanbul with a lack of porters and boatmen who were notoriously connected to the Janissaries. In addition, the government took the opportunity to run a general census in Istanbul and introduce domestic passports. Only obedient citizens could travel freely. But after the executions and exiles, enough now former Janissaries remained. Mahmud II's government was willing to leave rank-and-file Janissaries alone, as long as they did not cause any trouble. Some of the auxiliary Janissaries who remained loyal to the government during the uprising of 1826 were allowed to join the ranks of the new troops. There were some ex-Janissaries who were recruited to the victorious Mohammedan soldiers. The best chances of surviving the persecution of the Janissaries had notables of high rank. Important people with good connections to the upper classes of the Ottoman polity might have a chance of survival and future thriving. There was another group which had to fear persecution, although much more leniently. The abolition of the Janissaries was followed within a month by the government attack on the Bektashi, the dervish order most closely associated with them. The eponymous founder was patron saint of the corps, which was indeed often referred to as the Bektashi Corps. Prominent members of the order were executed and Bektashi property in Istanbul was destroyed or confiscated and sold or converted to other uses. However, the Bektashis were not in as much danger as the Janissaries, although the order was abolished on the 10th of July 1826. With the soldiers and the Bektashi leadership gone, it was important to normalize the situation in the empire. And normalize they did by confiscation of Janissary and Bektashi property. This saved the lives of a lot of scribes who, with most documents burned, could provide some vital economic knowledge to the government. The resources of the just abolished institutions flooded into the treasury of the new army. The 15th of June 1826 was a massacre. At the end of the day, this means that we have to look at the death toll. This is not an easy task. The numbers vary widely. It is not even clear whom to count. Although the government sources were silent about the civilian losses during the event, some evidence suggests that the imperial troops did little to differentiate between Janissaries and the civilian supporters. Lutfi claimed that some civilians and spectators were accidentally killed during the initial bombardment of the barricades. Günay lists some sources, and here the numbers of killed and exiled Janissaries range from 200 or 300 up to 20,000. The highest exaggerations go up to 60,000. Taking all sources into account, he reaches a number of 6,000 to 8,000 Janissaries killed and 15,000 Janissaries exiled. Suna talks of 2,000 to 3,000 executions in Istanbul in the time close to the event. Adding the rest of the empire, the total number of deaths may end up at 6,000. Goodwin guesses that 1,000 burned to death in the barracks, while another 1,000 were executed. Hechelhammer claims a straightforward number of 10,000 dead Janissaries. Let's put that into context. Around 1826, Istanbul had 450,000 inhabitants. 20% of those had Janissary titles, which gives us 90,000 Janissaries in the city. The number of Janissaries is nearly impossible to define, as we have seen in the video on the numbers after 1600. Maybe, taking the whole empire into account, they are also numbered in the hundreds of thousands. This means that even when looking at the realistic maximum, not more than 5% of Istanbul and/or the overall Janissaries were gone. Still, it was enough to lead to some problems. Suddenly, the policemen and firemen of Istanbul were gone. It took some months to introduce a new organization. And this is a good place to stop and take a look at what we learned today. Sultan III's attempts on reforming his empire failed and ended with his death. Mahmud II followed his lead and learned from his mistakes. Slowly but surely, he took charge and made alliances with multiple interest groups like the religious factions and other branches of arms, all without directly antagonizing the Janissaries. It was only in 1826 when Mahmud and his advisors decided to strike. With the backing of religious leaders, he found a new army, the trained, victorious soldiers of Muhammad, and ordered them to use modern training and equipment. Whereas every order had to give some soldiers to the new army, and new imams were tasked with replacing the Bektashi order in the Janissary barracks. On June 15, 1826, the Janissaries could take no more. They tossed over the cauldrons and began a revolt. On their way through the city, they met artillery. This branch of arms was loyal to Mahmud and opened fire. The insurrection attempt ended there, and the Janissaries withdrew to their barracks. Soon, government troops laid siege to them. The siege did not take very long. Cannonballs shattered the gate. The Janissaries died by the hundreds, either through fire or the artillerymen's weapons. The next day, Istanbul was searched, and in the following month the Sultan cleaned up the rest of the empire. Thousands died, and other thousands were exiled. So ended a 400-year history of Janissaries. And now it is your turn again. Do you think there was an alternative to the auspicious event? Tell me in the comments. Please do not forget to like, share and subscribe. So long, we'll meet again soon. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free